Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're watching us from. And sorry for the late start. We were accommodating traffic problems in DC this morning. So here we are. We're still going to have a very good conversation ahead. So I want to start off by welcoming all of you in the room and those who are watching online, and of course, our panel that I will introduce in a minute. And we're starting this week with a conversation on Pakistan. And of course, if you have been watching the news over the last few weeks, the coverage of Pakistan has been dominated by the impact of these historic floods, and they really are historic in terms of the humanitarian cost, but uh, just the numbers of lives lost, homes washed away, livestock debt that can't be replaced easily. But there's also going to be an economic and financial impact this year, next year, and for years to come in terms of the rebuilding, in terms of the impact it'll have on crops and agricultural production next year, and also the impact it'll have on macro indicators. And when we set up this panel first, this was before the floods. And in a way, what the current flood has done is come at a time when the economy of Pakistan was already at one of its periodic near crisis moments. Those of us who are Pakistan economy watchers know that every few years, with almost a sort of regularity, there is a near macro event in Pakistan, which is a reflection of underlying structural problems that uh, periodically manifest themselves in macroeconomic imbalances that become hard to control. And we had that here 5 years ago in 2018 near event, 5 years before that, 2013, 5 years before that, 2008, and it looked like we were getting to one of those moments again, and the floods came on top of that. The only difference is that, this year, uh, this imbalance and the problems that it might cause Pakistan are coming at a time when the international economic context is much less favorable. So you see prospects of a recession in the advanced economies, maybe a world recession. You see the issue of interest rates going up, high dollar values, and debt levels getting harder, markets, financial markets becoming much less willing to come forward with financing for emerging markets at low cost. And that's why we thought it would be very useful to have a conversation on Pakistan where we talk not just about Pakistan, but also about what this looks like in the context in which we are now faced. And that's why we have this great panel. So I'm just going to introduce them and then we'll start a conversation. Then I hope that you who are in the room will be able to raise some of your own thinking on this. And if we have questions online, we'll get those as well. So I'm going to start from the other end and work my way back to where I am. And furthest from us, of course, is Reza Bakr. Reza Bakr is currently a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Um, but of course, many of you will know him from his previous incarnation when, for a number of years, he was the governor of the Central Bank of Pakistan during a time when a lot of pressures were already there on the economy and trying to figure out how best to deal with them. Next to Reza is Madiha Afzal. Madiha Afzal is at the Brookings Institution, where she is a fellow in the foreign policy group at Brookings. And I want to, particularly when we get to Madiha, I want to sort of get her perspectives on the sort of politics of this, because as we beginning to recognize, not just in Pakistan, but more broadly, the countries where the economic problems are hardest to resolve are the ones where the political uncertainty is much more intertwined with the economic. So we'll come to that. Next to Medea is Liliana Rojas Suarez, who is, of course, senior fellow here at CGD and has been directing our Latin America initiative for a number of years. And there are probably more similarities in between Pakistan and a number of countries in Latin America now. And it'd be interesting to get a little bit of a perspective across from there. And finally, next to me is Ayhan Kos, who is the Chief Economist of Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions Vice Presidency at the World Bank, as well as being the director of the Prospects Group at the World Bank. And Ayhan, thank you very much also for joining us. So thanks to all of you, the panelists, for joining us. And if we're comfortable, I want to get started right away. And Reza, if I might, I want to start with you. So, you know, as I was saying, the economic indicators have deteriorated significantly. Inflation's rising above 20%. Growth numbers were already coming down. Now, after the flood, they'll come down even more for this year. There is an IMF program, which is not just an economic, but a very public discussion around it in Pakistan. It's the pros and cons of engagement with the IMF. Last review was a difficult review, but it finally came together. I wanted to start with your perspective and sort of how you see now the economic and financial situation going forward, and what you see as the risks are if we look out for the next 12 months. So if you could get us started, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Masood, and a very good morning to everybody. Thank you for putting this panel together, for the invitation, and it's really an honor to be with such distinguished speakers that you have put together. I would like to comment, Masood, that you can look at Pakistan from a structural perspective, you can look at it from a cyclical perspective. And my starting point is that if this is the 22nd or the 23rd IMF program, and IMF programs only come about when some underlying issues have not been addressed, the underlying issues are clearly structural. We can talk about, from a cyclical perspective, what might happen in this review, where the deficit or other targets will be adjusted, but that will be, at the end of the day, a cyclical discussion. I really want to take this few minutes to talk, in my view, what I see are the key structural impediments that have held back longer and sustainable trajectories. And these are three, in my view. The first is a small tax base with a low tax effort. I'll illustrate that because I myself was struck about the numbers. The second is a deeply deficient energy sector, which not only exacerbates a weak fiscal position, but it also undermines competitiveness of the industrial sector, including for exports. And last is subsidies, including to state-owned enterprises. Now, let me just illustrate on the first point on the tax effort. The most recent 7th and 8th review staff report of the IMF that has been published just in September states that the tax to GDP ratio for this last fiscal year, 2022, is 10.2% of GDP. So out of curiosity, I wanted to find out what this was 10 years ago. So I looked up what was the available IMF staff report 10 years ago, and it was the Article 4 and Post-Program Monitoring Report from 2012. And the tax to GDP ratio for 2012 was 10.2% of GDP, i.e. it is the same 10 years later to the first decimal place. So of course it would have gone up, it would have gone down, but the striking point is that in 2022, it was the level that it was in 2012 to the first decimal place. Out of curiosity, I went back another 10 years and looked at the 2002 July PRGF second review report published in July. The tax to GDP ratio then was 12.7% of GDP. So if anything, over these 20 years, it's about 2.5 percentage points of GDP less. So that's point number one. I think there's a separate discussion maybe to have had about over long IMF repeated programs, what is the balance of emphasis between structural and cyclical targets, but one could have that in a separate setting. Energy sector, Masood, in the latest figures, the circular debt is estimated at between 4 and 5% of GDP between the electricity and gas sectors. Now, this is an understatement of the level of circular debt because over years, circular debt has been fiscalized, which means it's transferred to the budget. If you add all of that up, the amount of fiscalization that has happened, the actual stock of circular debt is probably several times this figure of 4 to 5 percentage points of GDP. But just so that we also appreciate the long-standing nature of the energy sector problems, this 2012 report that I read, this is 2012 now, and I'm going to quote, "A highly constrained and unpredictable energy supply. This long-standing problem has been exacerbated in recent years by a lack of investment, price distortions, and poor management of the sector." So this is the fund writing in 2012 that is a long-standing problem. And the last structural impediment that I think has been key to preventing a good overall narrative are untargeted subsidies, which are again several percentage points of GDP. I won't go into details. I want to end by saying it's not all gloomy, because while I think some structural areas continue to be impediments, there are some examples of successes. One of them is the exchange rate. And for years, Pakistan had a fixed exchange rate that was a step function, usually kept uncompetitive, and one that undermined export competitiveness. At the beginning of this program that the then Finance Minister Hafiz Sheikh and I negotiated in June of 2019, one of the conditions was floating the currency. And in my time, when I came in May, it was around 140. It has ranged between 140 and 180 until my term finished, but then more than that as well. But what's most important is that the exchange rate has been showing a two-way movement. And historically, it always used to show a one-way movement, and that too as a step function. That, I think, is a key change for the better as far as structural impediments are concerned. And in my view, will be critically important to maintain that exchange rate flexibility, not only from a balance of payments perspective, but also, Masood, from the perspective of export competitiveness. With exports less than 10% of GDP, one of the key constraints, not the only one, has been the exchange rate. The other point that I will mention on the structural front is the independence of the central bank. Historically, the central bank used to lend to the government as one example of compromised independence. With the new law that was passed recently and approved, that has been prohibited. A number of other provisions have gone into that law that clearly articulate the objectives of the central bank. It will be, in my view, extremely important that both the spirit of this law, in addition to the letter of the law, is preserved so that another area of structural constraints remains addressed in a definitive manner. So let me stop there with some challenges, but also some examples of where structural progress has been made.
Thank you very much, Rosa. And I guess one of the points that we'll come back to, I'm sure, in the conversation is how do you ensure that the gains that are made, as were made on taxes in the early part of this century, are preserved. So central bank flexible exchange rates earlier on, improvements in the tax to GDP ratio, actually went up even beyond 12% at one point, but then it came back down again. So, how do you avoid losing the gains? So, we'll come back to that. Let me turn to Liliana. So, Liliana, there's that picture of Pakistan, but Pakistan is not the only country right now facing this nature of macro financial difficulties. Um, you've been looking at a lot of countries. Can you identify, in your sense, not just sort of the names of countries, which are always interesting, but also are there any common threads that you see across the countries that are emerging at this point with similar problems?
Thank you, Masood, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience. Yes, there are many countries right now that are feeling the stress, financial stress. And in the group of less developed, the least developed countries, the IMF has said that around 2/3 of developing countries are in some form of financial stress. But let's focus our conversation on emerging markets, on that group only. So within that category, let me first identify the countries that I think are the most stressed, okay? And in addition to Pakistan, which is in my list, I would add Argentina, Turkey, Tunisia, El Salvador, and Ghana. So throughout the spectrum of the emerging market regions. I would have included Egypt too. The only reason why it's not there is because recently it has become an important supplier of gas for Europe. So at this moment, at least for this moment, the macro economic imbalances are kind of contained by the fact that it's going to have a lot of revenues coming from gas exports, okay? And of course, I don't include Sri Lanka because it's already in default. So we know that there are many factors that affect outcomes, but I'm just going to focus on the macroeconomic situation. And the question is, how do I get into this list? So I ask myself a very simple question. Right. So the question is, using your own idea, is how resilient are you to a shock, right? And we know that the economies have been, since the beginning of the year, have been subject to many external shocks, right? I mean, Masood mentioned, not only COVID is not over, and was definitely not over at the beginning of the year, but you had the Ukrainian shock, I'm calling it the Ukrainian shock just to refer to the war, of course. Then you had the ongoing increase in interest rates, not only by the Fed, by other advanced economies, and as was mentioned also, the threat of recession, of global recession. So there are many shocks. So how do you know whether a country is resilient? It's not how the country is doing now, it's how the country was at the beginning of the shock, right? Because when the shock hits, it's too late, right? You were ready or you were not. So for identifying a resilience of a country, I basically look at two dimensions. The first dimension is how the country is ready to stand the shock, how strong is to actually, it's like somebody's going to punch you, how strong are you to stand the punch? And the second dimension is how ready you are to react to the shock. So if somebody's attacking you, now you're going to push back, okay? So in the first dimension of resilience, what I say, how strong you are, is how are your financing needs? If a shock, external shock is going to hit you, the most important thing that is going to happen to you is that most likely that external shock is going to create an increase in risk aversion by investors, by international investors. So most likely, if you have a large amount of debt, you're going to be in trouble. So what indicators do I use? Well, if I'm measuring financing needs, I need the current account of the balance of payments, because that's a very clear indication of financing needs, the stock of debt in the country, most importantly, the stock of short-term debt relative to international reserves. Because if, at the end of the day, if you lack access to market, your reserves are the ones, your international reserves, which are denominated in hard currency, are the ones that are going to show whether you actually have the liquidity that the markets are needing to make good on your due obligations, okay, on your due payments. And finally, I also look at your profile of payments. What if you have a large payment coming up, right? So that's the first dimension. And the second dimension measures the capacity to react. So the question is, how well are you standing in terms of your capacity to do countercyclical macroeconomic policies, which means monetary and fiscal policies? So those are basically the two dimensions. And of course, countries that start the whole situation or at the beginning of the shock are facing high inflation are in a very bad situation because they don't have much capacity to do a countercyclical monetary policy. If you have a large deficit, fiscal deficit, then you are in a bad situation to do a countercyclical fiscal policy. So the countries that I mentioned share basically, not all of them, not all countries had high inflation, for example, but in my sample, Argentina and Turkey stand out for their high level of inflation. All of them have large payments coming up, some of them incredibly large. The case of El Salvador is just amazing. I mean, they won't do it if there is not an IMF program coming to them. And all of them are in a situation where either they have a large amount of short-term debt or have depleted their international reserves, have very little reserves. So it's very simple. I mean, just a few indicators at the beginning of the shock, not when the shock is, but at the beginning of the shock can tell you how the situation is going to be evolving in the rest of the time. Thanks, Masood.
Thank you very much, Liliana. I think that's a very nice framework. And actually, as you were speaking, I was trying to think about the relevant numbers for Pakistan. And on at least a few of those indicators, the amount of money that you need to roll over the next 2 years, your gross financing needs, it doesn't do so well. Although pre-shock, the inflation numbers weren't as bad as they are in some of the other countries. You've been talking about some of the shocks, but one of the shocks we've been anticipating is a sharp slowdown in the world economy. And I guess, Ayhan, what I wanted to get your sense on is how bad do you think the coming slowdown in the world economy is going to be? I mean, you guys have done a lot of work on looking at this, but also how much of this is really an advanced economy worry? I mean, if you're an emerging market, how much should you be worried about a global slowdown as opposed to these other factors that Liliana's been outlining? So could you want to give us a little bit your thinking on that?
Thank you, Masood. It's great to be here with colleagues again in person, and always nice to come to CGD with these distinguished panelists. Now, let me think through three questions you ask. The first one, why should we worry about a global recession? And there, the arithmetic is very clear. The global economy is slowing, and slowing at a very sharp pace. In fact, it is the sharpest slowdown we have seen over the past 5 decades. We had 5 global recessions, 75, 82, 1991, 2009, 2020. In all of these global recessions, prior to the global recession, when the global per capita income contracted, global economy slowed very sharply. But this time, the slowdown that has begun last year, basically incomparably steeper. So in February, you look at consensus forecasts, global growth for next year was around 3.2%. If you look at that number today, it is 1.9%. When you get close to around 1%, that means you are getting close to having a global recession because per capita income will contract, given that the population growth is around 1. The second important issue is that there are 3 engines of the global economy, US, Euro, and China. These 3 economies have their own idiosyncratic problems. Euro area, of course, is having the impact of the war, high inflation, serious lack of energy as the winter comes in. In the US, elevated inflation, the aggressive Fed interest rate increases. In China, you have the COVID-related disruptions, as well as, of course, stresses in the real estate sector. These three economies have been slowing sharply, and in all likelihood, this slowdown will continue into the next year. Now, the second question, what does it mean for emerging markets? For emerging markets, external environment is becoming increasingly difficult. First, financing conditions are getting tighter. Liliana already mentioned that. And in all likelihood, we will see even tighter financing conditions next year. In fact, for the first time over a decade, we will see global real interest rates turning to positive rather than negative. So rolling over debt is going to be much more difficult. Now, the second, global trade has been slowing sharply. We downgraded our forecasts, and I won't be surprised if we downgrade more. And I think the third important point for emerging developing economies, Liana mentioned the emerging markets very nicely. When you look at low-income countries, the amount of non-concessional debt has increased dramatically over the past decade. The amount of debt on variable interest rates has increased dramatically over the past decade. So we are worried about the challenges low-income countries are facing, frontier markets are facing, and of course, in an environment when you have weak growth, higher interest rates, appreciated US dollar, you have this mix of explosion that can easily happen. So the big issue when you think about the 2009 global recession and 2020 global recession, there was aggressive support by advanced economies to keep activity going, to mitigate the impact of the global recession. This time, that type of support will not be there. In fact, there will be aggressive policy action to get ahead of inflation. And the last time this happened was in the early 1980s. And of course, the policy action, the increases in interest rates translated into the 82 global recession and a string of debt crises. And when you look at, Masood, you know these issues very well, 1980s is an exceptional and unfortunate decade. It's a lost decade for Latin America. It is a multiple lost decades for low-income countries. And there is a kind of a reason for that. When you look at the 1980s, you basically see the largest number of debt crises. In fact, the number of debt crises in the 1980s is larger than all the debt crises we saw, the total number of them in other decades. So I think this environment we have in all likelihood will be more difficult, and we need to see which countries are really resilient to stand the shock of financing, the weaker growth, and depreciating currencies.
Okay. All right. So, I'm beginning to look for some positive sense from this panel, but I'm struggling for the moment. So, Madhya, I want to turn to you actually, such a different perspective. One of the things that Liliana said is part of a two-part strategy is sort of how strong you are before you get hit by a shock, and second is how equipped you are to respond. How do you fight back? And she indicated some dimensions of what characterizes that. But one dimension of how well or how quickly you can respond is the degree of political consensus in a country that enables you to respond quickly to a shock. And one of the things I observe looking at Pakistan, but also looking at other countries, is that in a way, the countries where the economic problems are hardest to solve are the ones where the underlying politics makes it hard to solve them, rather than because the problems themselves are inherently more complex. I think Reza pointed out at the beginning that the macro problems and structural problems in Pakistan are well identified, and the ways to address them are relatively clear. But the inability to address them is much from the politics. And so Pakistan right now is also going through an exceptional bout of political uncertainty. And I wanted to get a little bit your sense on how you see the politics and the economics as being intertwined. We talk about the link from the politics to the economics, but there's also a link back from the economics to the politics,
Yes.
which in this case doesn't seem to be working. People don't seem to be the conversation is not around the deteriorating economic situation. So what's your reading of this whole situation?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me on this panel. It's great to be here with such diverse perspectives. Politics dwarfs all in Pakistan. So Pakistan has had a year of tremendous crisis, political, economic, and then, of course, this catastrophic flooding. But politics, in my view, and political instability has been the undercurrent that has run through the year. So if we look at April of this year, when there was a vote of no confidence that ousted former Prime Minister Imran Khan from power, that in itself was not a remarkable event in Pakistan, because political instability is not remarkable in Pakistan. In fact, it's par for the course. It's chronic. And that's because there are sort of three players at any given time in Pakistan's politics: the military, the incumbent government, and the opposition. And that just renders the whole system unstable. But what has been different, I would say, this time around compared to sort of previous iterations of political instability, I mean, Pakistan is a country where no prime minister has been in office for 5 years at a stretch, and an electoral term is 5 years. So that just gives you one sense in its 75-year history of how unstable the country is politically. What is different this time around, I think, is the reaction. So since April, former Prime Minister Khan has sought to cast the incumbent, the now government, as illegitimate, and has been calling for fresh elections and calling for the ouster of the government. This government can now only be in power for up to now less than a year. Basically, elections are constitutionally mandated by late next summer, but Prime Minister Khan wants elections to be held before then. And he's led huge rallies, has really shown sort of street power over this time. And so it's become sort of an unstable system in which the country is incredibly politically polarized. You have supporters of both parties, very vociferously in support of those. So there's the political instability, which is chronic. That happened to coincide, as you said, Masood, there's, Pakistan has sort of these cyclical economic crises. Those are also chronic, and the debt has been ballooning. Pakistan was 6 weeks away from default at various points through this summer. So there was the economic crisis. But I would say both are heightened relative to previous years. The economic crisis also because of external factors, Russia's war in Ukraine. And then both have affected the other, as you pointed to. I think both have exacerbated the other. So in my view, the political crisis has affected the economic more than the economic has the political. And I'll just go through why I think so. If we look at the effects of the political crisis on the economic situation, there's sort of the direct effect. There's essentially no policy or very little policy and policymaker continuity. So if we look at finance ministers over the last 7 months, Pakistan is now on its 3rd finance minister in 7 months. In Mr. Khan's term, it was Shaukat Tareen. There was a political decision made at that point to subsidize fuel prices that became very controversial. For 5 months during Mr. Shahbaz Sharif's time in power, Miftah Ismail was the finance minister. He worked very hard to actually put in place policies to try to comply with IMF conditionality. And we have seen, we saw the IMF loan come through at the very end of the summer, but he was undercut even then, even by members of his own party, because there are factions in this sort of unwieldy coalition government that is in power right now. And then, of course, now we have a new finance minister, Ishaq Dar, and his sort of stance is distinct from the previous finance minister, Miftah Ismail's, sort of a bit of a different philosophy. One example I'll give you is that the UNDP has in a policy paper said that Pakistan should try to seek debt restructuring in the wake of its floods, try to divert money away towards flooding, but Mr. Dar has said that he will not be seeking that kind of restructuring. And if one just thinks about, this is a country that was, that had sort of changed its entire policy stance over the summer, in particular with regard to fuel prices, which were rising, at sort of rates unforeseen, and inflation actually week on week at one point in August before the floods was 45%. People are really, really hurting. Prices of food staples were really, really high. And then you had a flood hit, and the IMF loan that the country was trying to go for was $1.1 billion, right? And then the flood hit, and it's caused damage of up to $30 billion plus. So it's just, it's sort of crisis after crisis, it's sort of a staggering amount. And what I'll also point out, so those are sort of the direct effects of politics. And then I think politics just serves as a distraction. And it's in some ways a distraction that benefits all sides because they don't have to make tough policy decisions. The focus of the media tends to be on politics. There was a very brief time period of sort of from the end of August to early September when everybody's focus was on the floods, but now it's back on politics, and so difficult decisions that need to be made are just not made because politics tends to serve as a distraction, and in some sense a beneficial distraction to this political class. The one thing I'll say about the other link, the economic to political side, is that it is part of the political narratives that both sides basically use to try to undermine each other. So it was part of the narrative that the current coalition government used to oust Mr. Khan, and it's part of the inflation is part of the narrative that Mr. Khan is using to try to destabilize the current government, but it doesn't form, as you said, the primary sort of focus of the country. I'll stop there.
Good. Thank you very much. So I had actually a few other questions, but I'm quite keen to get questions or comments from people that are here rather than go through what I had in mind. So I want to perhaps open it up and see if people have any questions or comments, and then we'll try and address those. So does anybody, I think Ijaz, Khalil, that's two already. Ijaz, yeah. Please, there's.
Thank you. It's wonderful to listen to the panel and get this whole spectrum of views on what ails Pakistan and the context in which Pakistan is placed to address its chronic ailments. Raza has worked very closely with the previous government. I have had the opportunity of working closely with the previous government as well, although not as closely as Raza. Let's assume that an election is held and that Mr. Khan comes back into power, which is what the trends are. Madiha, there's a fourth group which lurks in the background in Pakistan. And this group has come up as a result of 30 years of Pakistan's, 25 years of Pakistan's, the pattern of Pakistan's economic growth, in which the real estate sector and retail and wholesale trade have grown enormously. There's a lot of wealth concentrated in those sectors. And these sectors have been tax exempt, mandated by law. They're out of the tax land. so as are the farmers. Now, if Mr. Khan comes back into power, and we know that Mr. Khan has shown evidence he's reform-minded, the way he went for the independence of the State Bank of Pakistan, the market-based exchange rate, expansion of social protection, etc. He's a reform-minded person. My concern is that even he didn't quite tackle the energy sector problems. There are huge vested interests in energy subsidies in Pakistan. And given the rhetoric, given the political rhetoric, when he comes back into power, he will have to tackle this group, the fourth group, which is at the moment unrecognized, unmentioned in formal analysis. He will have to address that group. And that group is very powerful, and they manifest their power now by controlling the media. They own a large number of private TV channels in the country. And when you see this huge thing going, every time a government takes one measure, there's this massive reaction. It's all coming from there. So my question is, what will it take politically for the next elected government to tackle these powerful lobbies so that they can address the structural issues that Pakistan has faced for the last many years, made worse by the Afghan war and the kind of financial support Pakistan received to fight it?
Thank you very much, Ijaz. And just to say that group you're talking about is also sort of a group that would be in favor of an overvalued exchange rate, because they're primarily doing business by importing and distributing rather than by exporting. So it's also a lobby for overvaluation of the exchange rate. Should we take a few and then come back to you? I think might be better. So Khalil next.
Thank you very much, and actually enjoyed hearing from all the panelists and some very insightful comments. But focusing on Pakistan, Raza did mention the public sector. That is also a huge drain and a huge problem, a budgetary drain for Pakistan. And that is something that could be fixed more by administrative fiat. And that could be fixed. The deficit that comes from the public sector could be fixed, and that would require administrative actions and more reach to the private sector. So that's one. And what hinders that? Because efficiencies come in. We've seen the privatization has changed the face of a lot of industries in Pakistan where that's happened. And the second thing, of course, Madhya mentioned that political instability. But if you look at the country, you know, they used to say this about the British system. Governments may come and go, but they're two constants: the civil service and the monarchy. So whatever translates to be the core, the factor that holds Pakistan together, or the neutrals or the people there who bring in the government, who get them out. But that has been a constant factor in Pakistan. And, you know, in fact, they may be responsible for governments coming in and going. So I leave that. I'd like to see what your thoughts are. But let's.
The deep state, I think, is another term for it. Anybody? Sargachal, please.
Thank you very much, Masood and the panel. Alia Mubayed from Jefferies. The question that Matiha, I think, raised about the inconsistency of policies is extremely important, particularly in this unfavorable context and the sort of the external funding challenges that Pakistan is facing. And going back to the reaction function of what should be to strengthen the resilience, the question where we sit in the market is about what are the options for Pakistan today when we see the Prime Minister going and saying that Pakistan needs debt relief, and at least to ease its liquidity strains, immediate liquidity strains, because it has, according to the SBP, around 35 billion of external financing needs. And then we hear the finance minister say that, no, we will not be seeking debt relief. So how do we overcome this inconsistency, at least from a theoretical point of view? I mean, what would be your recommendation as a panel, whether looking at what should be done from other countries' perspective, or also what is possible given the new frameworks of debt treatment and debt resolution, and particularly the common framework, which obviously Pakistan is eligible for, I think, particularly under an IMF program.
Thank you very much, Alia. Okay, so let me just make sure. So can I have like two quick questions just to make sure we actually get answers as well, or reactions anyway. So I think that in the back over there, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my question is, do you see that the agriculture sector in Pakistan has long been neglected, and with the current floods, how would that affect the food security of the country? And then I have a question for Mr. Raza. The current kind of appreciation of the rupee, how do you see that, with the new governor and the new finance minister?
Okay, all right. Market-driven question mark. Jeff.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Hall with Open Society Foundations. And I'm confused about what happened last week, or maybe it was 10 days ago, with this UNDP report. And they said, hey, Pakistan should just stop paying its debts, and maybe there's a climate deal to work out and so forth. And I'm just curious if you all could shed a little light on what you think happened there. And does the UNDP report really have that much power? That would be one question I had. And the other is just, what do you make about the prospects for debt for climate in Pakistan?
So set of issues around debt, and we're happy to see who would like to pick those up. There's a more general question about sort of the common framework and where it stands. Maybe Ahan, you're best placed to deal with that. So I'll go around. But I think, Liliana, one of the things that would be quite interesting is to looking at the experience of other countries that are in a similar situation. How much of these points actually resonate more broadly rather than Pakistan as well? I think it'd be interesting to get that too from you. So shall we go in the order in which we first start? So I'll do it with you, Raza, first.
Sure. Great questions. Let me begin by talking a little bit on a positive side, because when you finished the first round of questions, you commented, Masood, about how gloomy this was sounding to you. So let me mention something that I think is not being talked about enough. Inflation is, of course, a huge problem, a huge burden. But there is the other side of inflation, particularly for those countries where domestic debt is large, which is that real interest rates are negative. For Pakistan, with a debt to GDP ratio of around 75% of GDP, about 2/3 to 3/4 is domestic debt. Pakistan's inflation rate right now is around 25%. It's funding itself on the short end at around 15% in the treasuries. So that's a negative real interest rate of 10%. Now, for those who follow debt, you would know that this is good for debt dynamics. And there's a broader point here. Doesn't mean that inflation, doesn't have cost. It has huge cost, particularly for the middle class and the poor, where food inflation is a lot higher. But it has that impact on debt sustainability that I think needs to be factored in. And I do see that, for people who are talking of sort of debt being very vulnerable, the vulnerability is on the hard currency funding, which for Pakistan over the next 3 years in its total external obligations is a small fraction. It's around less than 10% of the total obligation. So it's a nuanced point on debt. Of course, requires good overall management. Let me quickly mention, just quickly react to some of the other questions that came about. And just in the context of debt, I think there's been a lot of discussion of the UNDP report per se. For 4 years, when I used to be at the IMF before my central bank job, for 4 years I was the head of the debt policy division. And there's usually one principle that is pretty important, that the voice that matters is that of the institution that is putting money on the table. That is the multilaterals, including the IMF, and that would be private creditors. UN doesn't lend that much. And I'm going to make a non-UN specific point now, which is that creditors also don't like when others are being generous with their money. So it's important that the discussions about debt be focused around what are the views of the creditors, and particularly those who are putting money on the table, and that is the multilaterals at the end of the day. And they are the only ones that matter in the room when it comes to debt discussions per se. Agriculture, there is the broader story about the impediments in the agriculture sector, but there is a success story. And these are the crops that are unregulated in Pakistan, where productivity and growth has been strikingly better than others. So wheat is a very regulated sector, but look at maize and look at rice, where there is very little government interference in setting prices. And these are the crops, although they are smaller, but they do very well year in and year out. And if you talk to the stakeholders in those, they do not want any interference by the government either. They're very happy to continue to do what they're doing. I think Ijaz raised a good question about what would it take to get things done for the next government, whichever that is. I'm quite optimistic on that, and there's a reason. You rightly mentioned that there are vested interests that would not want taxation to increase to certain sectors. But back in 2019, when we were floating the rupee, it was the same vested interests that were heavily opposed to the exchange rate becoming flexible. As Masood pointed out, it's a lobby with similar interests. But at the end of the day, it got done despite all the political cost that ultimately accrued to the government. It's okay for a central bank technician to say, this is better from a technical perspective. But the central bank is not bearing the political cost of that, and that's coming. It was done. So it was done then. I think it gives hope that there are other things that with the stroke of a pen can be done. And the question is how you build ownership towards that. Similarly, there was a question on what's behind the recent appreciation of the exchange rate. In countries like Pakistan, the dollar is just like any other asset. It's an instrument not only for transactions, for meeting your external obligations, but also a savings instrument, an investment instrument. If you take that, then prices of other assets fluctuate in line with two things, fundamentals and sentiment. So if the dollar, just like any other asset in Pakistan, reflects these two factors, it's not that big a development per se. And people are, in my view, a little bit too much focused on what that may be saying underlying. But actually, they take that as a very healthy sign, because the big change in Pakistan since June of 2019 is the two-way movement of the currency. And historically, it used to be one-way movement. So if the exchange rate is adjusting now, whether it's due to an outlook on fundamentals or it is sentiment, it's actually a good thing, because it is showing that this structural reform, which I think was key, is doing what it was intended to do. Maybe I'll stop there, except I just wanted to maybe comment on one thing on the political transitions point, picking up on what Madhi has said, that you're very right, and more generally about the overhang that we see from politics. But I think one thing that is different in this government, this, I should say, electoral period versus the two previous parliaments, was that in the two previous parliaments, the Prime Minister may have changed, but the government itself completed its tenure. And I think that overhang of uncertainty on who's in power, it doesn't matter actually at the end of the day which particular party may be in power, but the uncertainty for business players about who it is that is in power, I think that undermines confidence of the business community, and that's why you don't find people making long-term investments in Pakistan. In fact, most of them are engaged in how to take their money out of Pakistan right now, because not knowing who is the identity of the person that they need to deal with for the next 5 years, which was not the case in the last two parliaments.
Thank you very much, Ross. We've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to walk through the other three panelists just to get any quick reactions. Madiha, can I come to you next?
Sure. I think that's exactly right. The last two governments in Pakistan were the only governments that completed a 5-year term in office, though the prime ministers did not. But in general, in my view, what undermines prospects for reform, coming to Ijaz's question, is political instability. And for the next government, whoever it may be, to try to put in place any kind of structural reforms, it needs a runway. Pakistan's government spend their entire time in power basically putting out fires, if you will. And so the condition for reform that is required is political stability. That being said, both parties at this, or both sides at this point, because the current incumbent government is a coalition of many parties, both sides are going after each other, not on substance, but basically on politics. So, there's no debate to be had on an economic plan for the country or structural reform. They just go after each other on politics. So there needs to be reform from within in these parties as well to try to actually, get down to business seriously when they actually do come into power. On food security, 90% of Sindh's agricultural crop was destroyed this year in the floods. I mean, and the waters are not going to recede by the time of the planting season this month. So the next crop, they'll also not be able to plant. So these farmers' lives have essentially been destroyed. They have no money. And, there's a lot of reporting from the area where you actually basically see reporters going to them. They say, nobody has been here to help us. So, what I've been struck by is the lack of focus. While, of course, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have, at the UN and also here in Washington, talked about climate justice, Pakistan seems kind of stuck in this conversation around, it needs money. It doesn't want this money to come in as humanitarian assistance. It wants it to be seen as a form of climate justice because Pakistan is responsible for less than 1% of emissions, but of course is enormously climate vulnerable, but it's still getting humanitarian assistance. And the humanitarian assistance at this point is not getting anywhere close to the tens of billions it needs. So in my view, what is required is actually a concerted focus to say, this is what we need for relief. Perhaps the conversation will have to wait until COP27 on climate justice. This is what we need for relief. This is what we need for longer-term rebuilding, roads, bridges, schools that have been destroyed, and actually get down to the business of doing that work. And if it seems that the best way to do that, if Pakistan cannot get assistance now to do that, Secretary General Guterres, again in the UN, has talked about debt swaps being a mechanism to try to, basically, to get Pakistan to sort of divert funds to more climate-friendly initiatives in exchange for debt. I mean, those are conversations that are not really happening. And so my advice, unsolicited as it may be, would be for the government to sort of focus on these things. There was one more question, I'll very quickly get to that, on sort of the bureaucracy. Yes, Pakistan's bureaucracy, inherited from the British, traditionally strong, but it has been undermined over the years. Various political maneuvers over the years have undermined it. So yes, the machine keeps on running, and pretty well. But there's also a political dimension to it. So when a new government comes into power, it does appoint, people that it wants. And so there's a significant amount of political turnover. And so again, that injects some policy discontinuity there, or at least just some, implementer, bureaucratic discontinuity there.
Thank you. And just to say that if you look back to the experience with COVID, Pakistan is one of the countries that actually managed the COVID crisis relatively well. And one of the things, actually, we had a session here at CGD that Reza reminded me of, that where we talked about that experience. One of the things that made it possible for them to manage it well was a coming together of the civilian, military, and other technical forces, the use of IT to really focus in on how to do isolation, tracking, tracing, and that's what contained the problem. I don't see that in relation to the current floods,
Yes.
where what you have is a little bit of a narrative on climate justice, but not the action that we saw last time. So it can be done. Yeah. It's not being done.
Yes.
And we just need to be very clear about that. Liliana, we're running out of time,
Yes,
but over to
yes,
you.
yes. Very briefly, just to address the question that what does it take, based on the world experience, to make reforms? Well, history has taught us a lot. If you look at countries that actually made a significant reform, you can look at the Latin American experience during the 80s and the, well, early 90s, and the East Asian episode. That took huge crisis. So the bad news is history tells you that you do a lot of reforms, deep reforms, when you have deep crisis. And the crisis go into every dimension. Not only what we've been discussing in terms of the balance of payment debt problems, but about the crisis that we have not mentioned because it has not been manifested yet, or maybe will not, and it's a banking crisis. We have not talked about, nobody's talking about the possibility of banks to collapse. And why, when a banking crisis hit, there is response? Because the payment systems collapse. That's it. In that situation, you get the consensus to make reforms. And that happened during the East Asian crisis and in the early 90s after the Latin American crisis. So I only have bad news. You really need much more, otherwise you don't break it.
Although I think the only little caveat footnote to that is that while it is the case historically that most or many reform efforts come from a deep crisis, it is not the case that all deep crises lead to reform
Correct.
efforts. So you could also
You're
then
making it worse.
stay in a period of stagnation
Yeah.
after a crisis. So it's not a remedy to be applied
No.
lightly. So
Of
the
course.
only thing I say. I was thinking exactly of Lebanon, Ali. So, Ayhan, last word from you.
So, okay, what can multilateral organizations do? I will quickly make 3 points, Masood. First, actually, Masood and Hannah, she's here, wrote this very nice blog at the beginning of the year about debt resolution, what should be done. I invite all of you to look at it. Unfortunately, I was talking to Masood before we came here. We haven't made enough progress since they provided very nice suggestions. But we have been working with the IMF, and obviously, common framework is the only game in town in practical terms, and it has to be improved. We have made suggestions in terms of the need to clarify the timeline. The second thing is suspension of debt during the negotiations to official creditors. Third, improving the kind of the equal creditor treatment, especially bringing private creditors to the table as quick as possible. And fourth, expanding the common framework to low and low middle income countries. Now, we are working with our shareholders to make progress on this, and it's great that we are having these types of panels, in this case in the context of Pakistan, but there are many other countries having these problems. The second point is that multilateral organizations, as Reza mentioned, need to put the money on the table whenever and wherever necessary. And when there is a debt challenge, these entities need to be the counter-cyclical support tool. I can talk about the World Bank. Since April 2020, we provided more than $27 billion to the SSI countries, more than $7 billion in just grants. So we have been providing right, left, center, net inflows to these countries. And finally, I understand the kind of the expectation from multilateral organizations to do something. We at the World Bank have been very vocal about the need to address their challenges. That issue is so critical after the global economy experienced the largest debt wave, most broad-based, and the fastest since 2010. And now, of course, we have this rapidly increasing interest rates, sharply slowing growth, and a very toxic combination for a string of debt crises. I think that the issue going forward, and I'm hoping that we will have a robust discussion during the annual meetings, is to bring the kind of the willing parties together to have a framework in place, a robust framework, ahead of 2023, hopefully. And as Liliana mentioned, you need to be ready to react. And so far, it's unfortunate that we are unable to say we have a framework to utilize to address their challenges in this century. The framework we have is still the framework we used in the previous century, but the debt problem is larger, debt base is much more complex. You have these changing roles of creditors, the private creditors, some large emerging markets, and I think at the end of the day, the challenge at hand is large and complex. Is it rocket science? No. Can it be managed? Yes, but it will require the will and the financing. I think we are lacking on both dimensions, and hope that we will address it.
Thank you very much, Ehan. So let me just say that to end on that last point of Ehan's, that just as Liliana said, that sometimes it takes a deep crisis for countries to come together to reform. You could make the same analogy for the international system, because just as the problems are chronic in countries, the shortcomings of the international response to debt, to financing, fixing the humanitarian relief system are also chronic. And the question I think one can take away also is, does it require a deep crisis or a string of debt crises like you had in the 1980s, like you had in the 1990s, which then led to the systemic reforms in the way in which we deal with these issues? Or can we actually try and get ahead of having those crises and deal with them beforehand? So I want to leave you with that thought, which Mark is smiling because it could be the basis of a blog he's about to write. But I leave you with that thought, and I want to thank all of you for being here, but I also want to thank particularly our panelists for starting us off with a great week of events here at CGD. So thank you all.